Coats are one of the most difficult garments to sew. However, this design has one thing that makes everything easier. When you are making classic coats, chances are that you will have to make major pattern alterations around your shoulders, armholes, chest, waist, hip area. However, this design doesn't have sew-in sleeves and it is relaxed around the waist area, so you will have no issues with fitting. Even if you pick for some reason one size smaller or larger, it will have a slightly different look on you, but it will definitely fit you. So we are skipping the most difficult part, but you will learn how to properly make a collar, single welt pockets, add a lining, and I will also show you how to make these fancy buttonholes. You don't have to make them, you can make keyhole buttonholes or regular buttonholes, or if you want to make it even simpler, you can use push buttons. Design-wise, I think this coat goes with everything. With dresses it looks super posh, but with jeans or trousers it looks very cute. You can find this pattern in our Etsy or online store. The links are down in the description. Please don't be upset that there are so many pages to glue together. That's just how it is with such big garments. Also, on the first page you can find the interfacing guide. Plus there are dashed lines on the pattern details that mark where you need to press on the interfacing. For this coat, I recommend heavy fabrics that has some drape. It can be wool, it could also be Chanel-style tweed fabrics, maybe even from cotton. Depends from the season you are making it for. For lining, I highly recommend using viscose fabrics because polyester ones give a sweaty feeling. You will also need matching threads for the upper fabric and lining. One spool for each is enough. And this time, let's go all in and use a woven interfacing. It has much nicer drape compared to the non-woven interfacings. You will need 6 buttons that are around 2.5 centimeters in diameter, or you can use push buttons to save some time. As an option, you can use a metal chain sew-on hanger, which you can find in sewing supply stores. This time for myself, I will make a hanger from the lining. Before cutting, it is extremely important to find the correct direction of the fabric. Imagine that you are a raindrop that falls on this coat and you should slide easily off. And for coats, 99% of time do not mix the direction of cutting. As you can see, all the hems goes towards one edge of the fabric and the necklines are towards the other edge. Yes, this consumes more fabric, but then again your coat will look beautiful for a longer time. However, for the lining, feel free to mix the direction as long as you follow the straight grain. Right after cutting, mark all the notches either with the fabric marker, soap, or make small cuts in the seam allowance. There's a cool new trick I learned which I will show you later. And for that one, cut 12 cm long and 3 cm wide straps from scraps that are left from lining. You will need 6 ribbons like that. They can be also slightly longer, shorter, maybe even wider or narrower, doesn't really matter that much. Last thing we need to cut is the interfacing. Remember to follow the straight grain here as well. For the hemline and sleeve hems, I simply cut 5 cm long tape. Start by pressing on the interfacing. Place your iron on the interfacing and count 6 seconds. Then lift the iron and place it right next where you had it previously, and count again. Don't slide the iron too much because the interfacing might get stretched out, or if it has too much glue, then the interfacing will peel off the fabric when you move the iron. It is super important to properly press the interfacing all over, so take your time. It took me around half an hour, so maybe even put some podcast in the background or nice music and just enjoy. Contrary to the usual sequence, let's start with buttonholes, because 4 of them will be made only on the right facing, so this is the perfect moment when we can easily work with it before it's sewn to the coat. It is my duty to give you a quick disclaimer about buttonholes. For blazers or coats, you should be using either keyhole buttonholes or bound buttonholes. Keyhole buttonholes that look like this are made with a special buttonhole machine, which I do not have. Here in Latvia it is possible to make them in a few ateliers and they cost like €2 each. But since I am a bit cheap, I will be making bound buttonholes, and they are actually the most fancy type of buttonholes. The regular buttonholes are meant for shirts or other light garments. I will not judge you if you will be using them. I have used them in the past as well, and from my experience they actually do last pretty well. If you are making keyhole or regular buttonholes, make them only on the right facing. If you are making these fancy bound buttonholes, make them also on the left front center panel. 4 on the facing and only 2 on the front center, as in this illustration. It is shown as if you were looking on the fabric's right side. Measure your buttons and add 1 to 2 mm for the buttonhole length. The center of the buttonhole is at those crosses on the paper pattern. Draw a straight line through it. In my case, because of my fabric type, I cannot use my marker on fabric's right side. I will mark it on the fabric's wrong side, and then I will use a hand stitch to transfer and see my markings on the right side of the fabric. For regular or keyhole buttonholes, you just need a single line, but for bound buttonholes, I always draw boxes like this. It is 1 cm high and for my buttons 2.7 cm wide. Adjust the width depending from the buttons you have. So this is how I transfer markings to other side of fabric. My marker works very well on the side of interfacing, but on the right side this wool fabric is too fluffy and it's difficult to draw any lines. Also, this marker goes out only with water and I am afraid that too much water on this fabric might damage it. Make these lines longer because it will help you a lot later to match the welt details. Speaking of welts, press on interfacing if you haven't done it yet. Then fold them on half lengthwise and press. Repeat with all 12. Mark 5 mm from the folded edge. Place the folded edge away from the center of the buttonhole. Match it with the horizontal line. Pin or even hand stitch as good as you can. Then mark the vertical lines on the welt. Your stitch has to go exactly between them, not a single stitch more or less. If you are concerned to do a backstitch, then simply stitch 2 times. After sewing on the first welt, place the second welt with that 5 mm marking. Make sure that the first welt isn't in the way and pin the second welt. Add those vertical markings and stitch exactly between them. Check from the wrong side. These 2 stitches have to go in parallel and the distance between them must be 1 cm. If it is plus minus 1 mm, then it is okay, but more than that is too much. They also have to start and end at the same vertical line. Please don't stress if it didn't work out this time, simply rip the stitch that is messing things up and redo it. It is very easy to fix it now, but if we ignore it and cut the buttonholes, it will not look good later, and it will be almost impossible to redo it. Draw triangles towards the middle line. Make sure you don't damage the welts. Cut the buttonholes open. I usually start with seam ripper to make the first hole, and then continue with my scissors. When cutting those triangles, stop 1 mm before the stitch. Don't cut on it, but try to get pretty close. Push the welts towards inside. Use a hand stitch to neatly fix them together. The folded edges are against each other. I recommend to keep them hand stitched together until the very end, because we will still do a lot of pressing, so they would keep their nice shape. When we lift the facing, we can see this triangle and we need to sew it on the welt. Definitely backstitch or double stitch. Do everything in your power to make sure it is stitched properly. Also, stitch only through the triangle and welts. Do not stitch on the facing panel, otherwise it will not lay flat. While we are here, let's take out those hand stitches because it is very easy now to access both sides of the fabric. For your information, it is very common to finish these buttonholes with a narrow and tight zigzag stitch here. It definitely will give much more durability. However, I will skip them because I feel they will look too heavy on this fabric. On some fabrics they actually wouldn't even be noticeable. Since I have a very thick fabric, I can tell you for sure that if I will press these buttonholes, these welts will press out and look randomly bulky. Therefore, I will trim one layer of seam allowance, half of the width. The goal is to avoid seam allowances ending at the same place. I cannot avoid it completely, but now it looks much better. It's time to make the pockets. For myself, I find them easier than those buttonholes, and everything else after this will go much faster, I promise. We need to copy that dashed pocket opening line. If you can, copy on fabric's right side right away, but I cannot, so first I will mark it on the wrong side with my fabric marker, and only then I will make hand stitches to transfer the marking on the fabric's right side. The main thing is to mark the edges and the lines outside the box, because those inside lines will not be visible under the welt and pocket details when we will be working on the fabric's right side. Let's prepare both pocket welts. Fold it lengthwise with the right sides facing. Pin the side seams. Make a stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. To avoid bulking, let's trim off the corners. Also, let's use the trick with seam allowances again and trim off half of the seam allowance for one of the layers. Now flip the welts from the inside out. I use my fingers to push the corners towards outside. You can also use some sort of pointy object to push them. Just be careful not to ruin the fabric. Press them so they would lay completely flat. Also give special attention to the side seams. Press them straight and sharp. And now let's prepare the under pocket. So here you can see there is a guideline that indicates where the pocket shield should be sewn on. Mark this guideline. Take the pocket shields. As you can see, they are resembling the shape of the pocket bag. They have 1 cm of seam allowance and you need to stitch them exactly on the guideline. So I marked the centimeter and placed it on the markings I made previously. Fold the pocket shield over the seam allowance and press it in a way that is matching the pocket bag. This step is optional, but I will do it to keep everything secured in the place. Make a stitch around 5 mm apart from the edge to fix completely the pocket shield to the pocket bag. Here I am marking the seam allowance so I would know for sure where to stitch. Place the welt on the lowest guideline, which is more closer to the front opening. The raw edge goes towards the side seam. Make a stitch from one welt side seam to another. By the way, these side seams should match with those shorter guidelines. I used to get very confused about the direction where the welt goes. Just always try to picture that eventually you will flip it, so at this point it sort of have to be in an opposite way. On the other guideline, place the under pocket, the one you prepared with the pocket shield. Lay it on the coat panel with the right sides facing. And here as well, if it feels confusing, imagine flipping this pocket to the direction where it will be when this coat will be finished. This time the pocket bag has seam allowances, so place it in a way that the welt is in the middle of those seam allowances. Make sure that you push away the welt detail, we don't want to accidentally stitch on it. Now stitch according to the guideline. Remember that the length of this seam has to be exactly the same as for the welt. Speaking between us, it's fine if it is slightly shorter. It's not ideal, but the welt detail will cover any imperfections. However, if you make this stitch longer, then the welt detail won't be able to cover it. For that reason, actually this type of welt pockets is the most easy to make, because you do have some room for small errors. But I guess I shouldn't be saying that out loud. I could have been more precise here, but this is okay. On the wrong side of the fabric, draw a line between the stitches with triangles at both ends. Cut along those lines. When cutting those triangles, stop right before the stitches. Flip the pocket back towards inside of the coat. Take the top pocket's right side and pin it to the welt seam allowance. Make a stitch slightly above the previously made stitch towards the welt seam allowance. Technically, you could have stitched both welt and top pocket with a single stitch, but I find this way slightly less confusing. Flip the top pocket towards inside. Make sure that everything lays completely flat. Let's stitch these triangles to the welt panel. I will use a lot of pins to fix everything into place. Also, it can happen that the pocket bags don't lay perfectly on top of each other. Don't worry about it, we will slightly change the pocket bag shape. The priority is that the welt panel and the under pocket bag with the pocket shield are laying completely flat on the table. And backstitch those triangles very well. Press from the wrong side. Repin the pocket bags if you need to. Stitch around the pocket bag starting from one triangle to another. It is okay if you start 1 to 2 mm after those triangle stitches. And here as well, if you are a professional, then you could have stitched the pocket bag and triangles with a single stitch. But sorry, I wanted to do one step at a time. By the way, I very often have this issue with pockets, that one layer is sliding somewhere else and I cannot properly sew them together. To avoid that, I leave sewing machine's needle in the fabric, lift the presser foot, flatten out both pocket layers and turn the pocket bag and continue sewing. Please don't worry if your stitch looks as ugly as mine. This is a common thing for lining material, it will go out with pressing. Place the welt along the guidelines. If you have a heavy-duty sewing machine, you can make a stitch right on top of that lower layer of the welt panel. Since my machine definitely cannot do it, I will simply stitch those edges with the hand stitch. It helps me a lot to pin the welt to the coat. I am trying to stitch in a way it is not visible, but at the same time make sure you have stitched them quite strongly, because these edges will get a lot of pressure every time when you will be sliding your hands in and out of pockets. While we are here, I will take out the hand stitches that I used as markings. Let's stain the pocket bags so we can make them nice and even. I think you can already see a difference here. We have already done a huge part of the work. Let's join together the center panel with the side panel. Start by matching this shorter edge. Lay both panels with the right sides facing. Pin it together. And as you can see, we cannot nicely match the longest part of the seam. Therefore, let's make a cut in the corner. This cut should be around 7 mm, but not more. And now we can straighten out the rest of the seam and continue pinning it to the hem. Stitch from the side panel side so you can control that corner area. You can also make that cut while you are working with the sewing machine, because then you will be seeing better how far you should cut. Press the seams open. Lay both back panels with the right sides facing. Pin the middle seam and stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. Press the seam open. Lay front panel on back panel with right sides facing. Pin the shoulder seam, and while we are here, let's pin the side seam as well. You can work with each seam separately, but to save some time, I will work on shoulder and side seams together. And I will pin the other front panel as well. Stitch all 4 of these seams 1 cm apart from the edge. When you have finished, press all of them open. Generally for coats you press seams open for the upper fabric, but for lining you press seams towards one side. A new day for me, and let's prepare the facing. Take the hanging ribbon and fold it lengthwise on half with the right side towards outside. Press it, and here you have a guideline. Fold the raw edges towards inside so they match this guideline. Now fold it again and press. Make a stitch 1 mm apart from those 2 folded edges. Press it again because probably sewing machine has made it wavy. Take the back facing and find the middle point by folding it on half and mark it down. Mark it on both upper and lower edge. You can also make small trims instead. Now fold a hanging ribbon and find the middle point. Place it against the back facing's middle part. Fold in the raw edges of the hanging ribbon. Remember that this ribbon shouldn't be too tight when the coat is finished, and that there is also a seam allowance. Secure it into place by making a stitch 5 mm apart from the edge. In case you have a label you want to stitch on the back facing, this is the most convenient time to do it. Here you can see something very dumb I did. Please ignore my hands, but look at the illustration. Lay the front facing with back facing right sides together. Pin the shoulder seams. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. And do not be like me. Make sure that the neckline edges go with the neckline. Press these seams open. Lay coat panel with facing right sides together. Pin the opening edge starting from the notch on the neckline, go around those corners and down to the hem. Stitch 1 cm apart. Repeat these steps with the other side. Go very slowly around those corners because they are like the centerpiece of this coat. And also make sure that the other corner is in exactly the same shape. After that we need to understitch the facing. Make a stitch 2 mm apart from the previously made seam on the facing side, while also catching the seam allowance. Start understitching somewhere below these corners. It is almost impossible to do understitching on that rounded part, and that's fine. Pick a starting point that you can easily access with your sewing machine and start from the same place on the other side of the opening. This is how it should look like. The seam allowance is fixed towards facing. Let's use the same trick again. Trim off 1/2 of facing seam allowance. This will reduce bulking big time. The idea is that the largest seam allowance will cover the shortest one and it will sort of even out slowly. Do this all over the seams that are connecting facing to the coat panel. At the corners, also make small trims in the largest seam allowance. Be very careful not to cut in the seam. And also, you can slightly trim off the corners itself. Flip the facing from the inside out. Pull the stitch towards the edge as much as you can and press the corners. I like to use a strong needle to help with that. Just be very careful not to damage the fabric. And yes, I don't want to admit, but this time I pressed through a scrap fabric of my silk lining because I got too paranoid that direct heat might ruin my wool fabric. Normally, I don't recommend that, and never ever put a wet scrap fabric on top of your garments to press. When you are pressing the area that has the understitch, press it in a way that you can see 1 mm of the center coat panel. Lay the collar band right side to collar's right side. Match the middle points. Pin them together. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. Press the seam open. This is a very different way how to make collars compared to when we make collars for shirts or other like garments. For shirts, we usually stitch collar panels together and only then add the collar bands. But for blazers and coats we work this way, firstly because this reduces the thickness from seams, and secondly, thicker fabrics fall around your neck much better if we make collars this way. This isn't a mandatory step, but I will top stitch the seam allowances 1 mm apart from the previously made seam. I will top stitch on both sides of the seam on both collar panels. So 4 times of top stitching. Yeah, I think I should have done better, but alright. Place both collars with the right sides facing each other. Notice that the under collar is smaller than the top collar. That's for a good fit around your neck. So don't be surprised that these details don't lay exactly flat on each other. Main thing is to perfectly match the outer edge. Pin around and stitch 1 cm from the edge. Here as well, take your time for the corners, make them as rounded as you can and make sure that they are exactly the same shape. Flip the collar from the inside out. Understitch the under collar along the upper edge. Here as well, you probably won't be able to understitch the corner. Just pick a point that you can access with the sewing machine. Just in case, a quick reminder, understitching here means that you stitch together the under collar with the seam allowance. I prefer to do it from the right side of the fabric because then I can easier see the distance from the previously made seam. But maybe for you it is easier to work from the other side. Trim off 1/2 of one layer of the seam allowance. While we are here, let's also trim off the corners. Just be careful not to cut in the seam. I will also make some cuts in seam allowance to release the fabric. The more curved is the shape, the more cuts you should do. They should stop around 3 mm apart from the seam. Flip the collar from the inside out. Push those corners toward outside as much as you can. Press these corners flat, but here where you have the understitching going on, press it in a way that you can see 1 mm of the top collar. We don't want to leave the collar bands living separately, therefore we need to stitch them together. Go from the inside and take the seam allowances from the both collar bands. Match the middle points. Pin them together and stitch these both seam allowances. Realistically, this stitch will be around 4 mm apart from the edge. Don't stress if it is less or more, our goal is to fix them together. Start stitching around 3 cm apart from the collar's lower edge. My sewing machine is struggling because the left side is so thick, but it did the job. In case yours cannot handle it, just stitch by hand. It doesn't have to be beautiful, but it has to be functional. After that, lay the under collar with the coat panel and the top collar with the facing. Right sides are facing each other. Start by pinning the middle points and then place the corners of the collar band exactly at the opening between facing and the coat. By the way, that collar seam should match with the shoulder seam. I wish I could make a single stitch around, but that's not really possible. Stitch from one collar band's corner to another, then start a new stitch on the other side from one corner to another again. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. On those corners, try to imagine that you have to connect this stitch to the stitch that's joining the facing and coat. Most likely you won't get to connect them, but try to get as close as you can. Press these seams open. I am using my small sleeve ironing board because it is difficult to lay the coat flat on my normal ironing board. In case you don't have such an option, try to use the edges of your big ironing board to press these seams. Here we have exactly the same situation we already had. We need to take the lowest part of seam allowances and put them together. Start by matching the middle part and pin these two layers together. If you need to, trim off some parts of other seam allowances that are in your way. Make a stitch from one notch to another. This stitch can be 3 to 4 mm apart from the edge. Lay back lining panels with the right sides facing each other. Pin the middle seam. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. If you have a very light fabric and sewing machine's backstitch is destroying it, try making 3 stitches ahead, rotate the fabric, stitch in opposite direction, then rotate again and continue sewing. Also, holding the loose threads from the beginning of the stitch helps to straighten the fabric and avoid getting your fabric sucked in that opening. Yes, my fabric gets slightly gathered, so I firstly steam out the stitch and make it look even and smooth. If your fabric gets terribly gathered, then you should change the tension level for the thread on your sewing machine. Press the seam afterwards towards one side. As you probably noticed, there are 2 notches on the back. We need to make a pleat. So first match these notches and pin together. Then push this pleat towards one side. Use a sewing machine to secure it into place. Stitch some 7 mm apart from the edge. This pleat is very important to give you more ease so you can move your arms freely without worrying that you might break the lining, which is quite a fragile fabric. Press the upper part of this pleat. Lay the front panels on the back panel with the right sides facing. Pin the shoulder seams and the side seams. Very important, for one of the sleeves you will need to leave an opening. Doesn't matter on which sleeve. Mark some 15 centimeters and leave this part unstitched. Don't make it too close to the sleeve hem, but also don't go inside the armpit area, somewhere in the middle. Stitch both shoulder seams, one full side seam and then the other side seam while leaving that opening. Press all of these seams towards one side. Take the lining and lay it with the right side to the facing's right side. Match the middle point with facing's middle point, then match the shoulder seams and the rest of the seam. You can do it in one single stitch, but I prefer to start from the top middle point and stitch to the hem, and then start again from the middle point and stitch to other hem. I do it this way because in case the length isn't perfectly matching, then it is easy to correct the hemline. But if the length doesn't match with the upper middle point, then we have a big problem. Press the seam towards lining. I will also give a light press from the fabric's right side. Lay the coat and lining panels with the right sides together. Match the seams and pin the hemline. Also, don't feel weird that the facing's hem is at a weird angle. The goal is that the lining doesn't creep out and is not visible from the outside. Therefore, the facing is gradually decreasing. When pinning the corners, it is better that the facing is more towards inside. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge. During the first years of sewing, I didn't know about that opening trick at the sleeve, so I actually left the opening at the bottom hem. I hope you can prove me wrong, but hand stitching the hem for coats or blazers never look as good as sewing machine seam does. Also, this is so much faster. Carefully trim off these corners. Also, you can make small snips in the seam allowance to release some tension. Mark the hem allowance, which is 4 cm, on the coat panels. Fold it at those points and pin together at the seam allowances. You will need to stitch the seam allowances together. If you can use a sewing machine, but my fabric is too thick, so I will use a hand stitch. Be careful to make these securing stitches only on the seam allowances, and don't stitch on the coat or lining panels themselves. Make at least some 4 or 5 stitches to know that they are properly holding together. Repeat this step with all these vertical seams. You can also do a few invisible stitches in between those seams, connecting the hem allowance to the coat itself, but there is no need to stitch around completely. In my opinion, this is the trickiest part. Match the slim hems of coat and lining and place the right sides against each other. And I literally mean against. Match the seams and pin around. I know how tempting it is to place the lining sleeve inside the coat and simply stitch around, but then you won't be able to flip the coat from the inside out. Trust me, I've been there, done that. This is how it should look like. Stitch 1 cm apart from the edge and take your time to straighten these both layers under sewing machine's presser foot. That way you will keep the seam allowance evenly wide and also avoid stitching creases in the lining. It should look like a long tube. Work in a similar fashion here and mark 4 cm of the hem allowance. below the hem allowance and fix together the seam allowances. Repeat this step with both shoulder seam and the side seam for both sleeves, so you have to do this 4 times together. Remember those rectangular scraps we cut at the beginning? Take them out. It's important to fix the lining to the coat because you don't want the lining to go wild. At the same time, we don't want to fix the lining too tightly to coat because it will take away some freedom of your movements, and also the lining will wear off sooner. So this is a very nice compromise. We will stitch on the seam allowances, but at the same time there will be some distance between the lining and the coat. So you need to add them on both shoulders, below the armpit area, and also let's use them on pocket bags so they will always be heading towards the coat's opening. You can slightly freestyle with the point you are sewing it on. Just make sure if you stitch it 20 centimeters from the neckline, then you need to stitch it the same 20 centimeters from the neckline on the lining side as well. Pin this ribbon on the seam allowance. Leave some 7 centimeters in between and then pin the other side of this ribbon on the lining seam allowance. Use a sewing machine to stitch it and keep it strictly on the seam allowances only. Do not stitch on the lining or coat panels themselves. When it comes to the pockets, lay them flat. Pick a spot on the pocket bag. Pin the ribbon to it and then pin the other side of the ribbon to the opening edge seam. Here as well, keep it strictly on the seam allowances. I was so excited to show this flipping process in our Instagram profile that I forgot to film it with our normal camera. So find that opening in the sleeve and then pull that furthest corner of the coat through that opening. Take your time, it is very doable. Sometimes it gets slightly stuck, just be careful not to break the lining. Just pull like centimeter by centimeter and it will be good. Let's press the sleeve and bottom hems. Take some control measurements. If the total hem allowance is 4 cm, then the visible part is 3 cm. Do some corrections with your hands if you need to, and then press them down and press as heavy as you can. When it comes to the bottom hem, we have those special corners here. Measure 3 cm of the hem allowance and push the corners towards inside. Flatten that area and make the upper fabric hemline look straight, while the hemline for facing and lining is going upwards. You can even hand stitch or use pins with glass heads to fix the hemline in place, then press it. The goal is to make this corner super sharp. Make sure that you press it in a way that no facing is visible if you were looking from the coats outside. Then press the rest of the hem while also pressing the seam that connects lining to hem. This pattern has a nice for lining that makes the lining to slightly fold over this seam. I know that many sewers like to press down that fold. Personally, I don't do it because this fold is meant to move up and down when you are moving around. So pressing in a sharp lining hemline doesn't make sense to me. Therefore, I leave this fold soft for both bottom hem and sleeve hems. If you have a chance for the collar, I recommend to put the coat on a mannequin and lay the collar in a way you like how it looks and put some steam around it. Life goes in circles, and now we need to return to buttonholes. If you are making the regular buttonholes, stitch 2 of them on the left center panel, also through the facings layer, the top one and the third one. If you are making bound buttonholes with me, then we need to cut open them on the facings layer as well. This is a bit scary, I know. First, you need to transfer the exact corners to the facing side. You have to be very precise on this. Then use a marker or soap to draw a similar shape as we did before, with that center line and those 2 triangles. Meditate for a second to be sure it is exactly matching. Then take your scissors and cut it open. Fold these edges towards inside so that fold line is matching the stitch you can see from the inside. Use a hand stitch and stitch that fold line towards the previously made stitch. Try to do it as invisible as possible. Be extra careful with those corners at triangles, because sometimes I pull out some threads from the fabric by trying to stitch those corners. For me, this is always the most nerve-wracking moment, but the main thing is not to cut too deep or too much. If it's a bit too small or something has gone on the wrong direction, with an iron you can fix a lot actually. Give a very nice press over these buttonholes. We have almost finished, so you can take all those hand stitches from the buttonholes. Now you can sew on the buttons. I always massively overthink about the button placement, and I don't actually follow the paper pattern at this point anymore. I find the placement of the buttons based on the buttonholes I have made. I lay my garment, this coat or any other garment flat on the table, and then I sew on the buttons in a way that it closes perfectly. If you have some sort of trick how to speed up this process, please share in the comments. Just to be sure, make a quick try-on and see if everything fits well. If so, it is time to close that opening in the sleeve. So flip the sleeve towards you so you can access the lining. Then stretch out that opening in a way it goes together. Pin it down. Of course, the seam allowances have to go towards inside. So there are 2 folded edges and you have to stitch on top of them. Keep around 2 mm distance from the edge. This stitch doesn't look fancy indeed, but no one is going to look there. You can also look on ready-made coats and blazers, they all have this seam in one of the sleeves. I cannot believe we have finished. Instead of asking you to buy this as a pricey sewing course, we could be very grateful if you left us thumbs up, because we put insane amount of energy to make this pattern and tutorial. And we want to make many more tutorials like this, so subscribe to our channel and see you in the next video. Bye!